right. Good evening, Internet. Welcome to the Gospel Story. I'm so glad that you're joining us. Oh, wait, you may be saying, Nelson, where are you at? Are you in where's your black background? Your black background. It's not here. You're right. In case you're wondering where I'm at, I'm actually filming on location. I am in beautiful and gorgeous New England right now. I am here for a few days taking care of some family business. I'll be back in Miami at the end of the week. I'm working on location from here, but it's beautiful. Today it was about 73, 74. Rainy a little bit in the morning. I know that it was raining a lot in Miami today, but let me tell you, it's gorgeous. There are actually, guys, in other parts of the country, there are these things called trees that they turn different colors. It's amazing. Like they've been hiding the whole life, but they're beautiful. They're like red and green and yellow, orange, all these beautiful colors. So I'm sure most people outside of Miami know this, but it's really nice to see these things. And by the way, if you guys are joining us on Facebook or on YouTube, say hi to us. Leave a comment, share with us how your day's been, how it's going, where you're watching from, maybe, because we want to share with you guys in the chat and see how you're doing, checking in. We see there's a few of you guys joining us from, let's see here, we got 7 Miami Temples YouTube. What's up, YouTube? We're starting to get more people coming in on the Facebook side of it. Good to see you, Sherry Ann. Good to see you, girl. Thanks for joining us here today. And we are so excited you're joining us today for the Gospel Story. This is going to be a fantastic time because now, as you probably saw, we are moving away from these big kind of world encompassing narratives that have to do with everything from like creation and the flood and now the post-flood, to now we're zooming in on the story of one single guy. And the rest of our season this year is going to focus specifically on the life and journey of Abram from the land of Ur. Abram, he is known as the father of the faith. And all 3 monotheistic religions that exist in the world, this is to say, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all of us believe that Abram had a big role to play in the establishment of what the world understood to be monotheism. And so he's a huge giant in terms of all of the faiths that in terms of monotheistic faith. And so we're going to be learning a little bit about his story starting tonight and learn where he came from. But he's known as a father of the faith, not just because in some ways, yes, his story is what many of the 3 monotheistic religions base their views on. But in many ways, as we're going to see, is that the story that Abram goes through and the journey that he lives is a story of faith between he and God that many of us kind of share. That if we think about how our own life is, we'll see some of ourselves in the stories of Abram, the experiences that he experiences as he journeys from this point of beginnings to where we're going to leave him at the end of the season. This is going to be beginning of 2021. It's going to be a cool journey, but we're starting today. And as always, I want to welcome my good friends and colleagues into the stream. We'll start with our senior pastor, our good friend Ep8 Cortez. How you doing, Ep8? Good to see you.
Good. How you doing, man?
Good, man. How's everything today?
Everything was rainy and wet here in Miami.
I imagine. And also with us, as always, our wonderful, insightful youth pastor. Brian Seawalt. How you doing, man?
Hey, man. How's it going?
Good, man. All right. I feel like
it feels like winter in Puerto Rico, bro.
Winter in Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
Always raining,
man.
Yeah, I can imagine. It was like I said, it's in the 70s or 60s here. I'm wearing a long sleeve shirt because I'm still not used to this. 60s is like cover the orange trees because it's gonna go bad.
So jealous. I'm looking at the wallpaper, man. That doesn't exist here, man.
So these houses are kind of older, in case that you didn't remember. But this is a very New Englandy setup here. Like there's
character, man, full of character.
Yeah, yes. My wife says this. All these New England homes have character. She's from New England. For those of you that don't know, you got Par of Year statue. You got the duck rides here of the Boston Commons and whatever. And Minuteman over here is very very New Englandy. You know what I'm saying? I like
colonial. Yeah.
Huh?
Colonial.
Very colonial. Exactly colonial. But anyways, man, this is gonna be a fun day. We're excited to have everybody here. You guys ready?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's do this. So without further ado, guys, I'm gonna slide you guys off here, put myself in the main deck. So today we're going to begin reading from the book of Genesis, we're gonna start from Genesis chapter 11 because if you remember, we ended up last time on Genesis chapter 11 and we talked about the Tower of Babel. And so we're going to take today from Genesis chapter 11 all the way to Genesis chapter 11:10, all the way to near the end to verse 27, because we're going to be looking at some of the descendants from Shem. This was post-flood. So I'm reading here from the New King James Version. It says in Genesis 11:10 onward, says, "This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Asparxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Asparxad, Shem lived 500 years and begat sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Selah. And after he begot Salah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters." I won't comment on this yet, but we'll get to it in the end. Salah lived 30 years and begot Eber. After he begot Eber, Salah lived 403 years and begat sons and daughters. Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg. After he begot Peleg, Eber lived 433 years and begot sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reu. After he begot Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and begot sons and daughters. Relu lived 32 years and begot Serug. After he begot Serug, Regu lived 207 years and begot sons and daughters. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. After he begot Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and begot sons and daughters. Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. After he begot Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. Now Terah lived 7 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And you know what? Yeah, that's a good place to stop. We're just gonna, as we usually do, we always talk about three kind of sections. And so what I'm gonna do here, exit solo layout, guys, you see that there's this big long list of people whose names we would probably not name our children. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no regular names up here. Brian, you're muted.
I know an Eber. I think he's the pastor here in Florida Conference.
Who?
An Eber?
Eber?
Yeah, you mentioned Eber, right? Somewhere here. Yeah, verse 16.
So Eber, did I just trash this man's name? Is there an Eber in our conference? Nobody's a name Eber. Meanwhile, Eber. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Eber.
Sorry.
You gonna disrespect Eber and Eber Jr.? I'm sorry. But you're right. Okay, so one name out of like 20 generations.
They are weird names, though.
They are uncommon names. You're right. I actually have an Eber in my last church. He was a good dude. But you're right. These are uncommon names. And so what do you guys notice here as we're looking at all these names coming out this time post flood, but we're looking at strictly Shem's line?
What do we notice from that particular section? Where
Yeah, just these names. There's not a whole lot we can
all
say.
the names. I mean, I don't really notice much unless you go into like a name dictionary and kind of look up these names and see what they mean.
Mhm.
But well, what I see here is like, I think of Abram when further on the story where he's like, hey, you're gonna have a kid, and he doesn't believe, and it's like, typically, at least in Hispanic households, you tend to be like, oh, my great grandfather, he did all this dumb stuff and he's still alive, he's doing well. Like, oh, my grandfather, yeah, he wasn't vegetarian, but he lived till he was 150, so I'm good. And so we believe all these things that we're going to be okay because so-and-so was okay in our lineage. And what it comes down to, I guess, like when I'm reading all these names, like some of them were 100 when they begot their first child. And it's like, Abraham, why were you having such a tough time with this? It's like, oh, my grandfather had a kid at 100.
Mm-hmm.
That could probably happen to me too. And so it's, when I read this, it kind of makes me think about that. It's like, what was so tough about waiting a little bit longer?
Yeah. Nephew, any thoughts on this one initially?
I got nothing.
You notice that some of these names, man, like they're crazy. You're right, Brian. If we were to do a little study, I'm sure you probably could get more on the names. We don't speak Hebrew naturally, conversationally, so we don't know this off the top of our heads. But something that we do see, as you probably see if you're reading this, that the years that people are starting to live is progressively starting to get a little bit lower. You see Shem starting off, and he lives 500 years and has sons and daughters. But by the time we get to verse 20, 24, and 25, you have Nahor. Nahor is living 119 years and begets sons and daughters. And so you go from like 500 to like 400 or to 100. You kind of see what God had said before, where it's like, listen, humans are going to live now for about 100, $120, more or less. And so you start seeing that generationally. God doesn't just automatically say, okay, boom, 120, and then the next guy that lives, he only lives 120 years and dies. But you start seeing that God, his word happens, but here's the key, is that sometimes it takes time for that to actually develop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Nelson, to Brian's point, if you read, they started having kids younger and younger. So Nahor had his first son when he was 29 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's where Abraham, like, he's already in his 90s.
Yeah. I mean, you got Shem in verse 10. The dude, was 100 years old, but he begot Arphaxad and lived 2 years. His first one was born 2 years after the flood, and dude was 102. But you see, after he begot Arphaxad, it says that he lives 500 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the dude lived 500 years after. So if you compare the time, like, okay, 100, if you're living 500 years, is kind of like 100 is the new 20 back then.
Yeah.
But if your time is limited now, people, you're right, are starting to have kids younger and younger and younger because you have time to contend with. Not as much time to contend with, rather.
Yeah.
But this is where I think one of the important points to notice is that people are like, well, what happened to, God said it, why didn't he do it? This is where I think one of the lessons, I think, for me, as we're looking into this, like, where's the gospel story in this? One of the things is God had said that humans won't live 120 years, but he didn't just do it in one go. Sometimes for us, it takes a while to see God work in our lives and for what God has decreed to happen. And I think that's what we're going to see in Abram's story. So I think is that it? Is that it for this situation?
That's a good intro. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that being said, we're going to just jump here and check out this next section here, which is found in the book of, once again, it's found in the book of Genesis. And this time we're going to read down Genesis 11 from verse 27 to the end of the chapter. And if you have a kind of like a header on your Bible, you might see where it says Terah's descendants, because now we're focusing on the story of Terah. This is Abram's father. So it says this in verse 27. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah and Haran died before his father Terah in his native land, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The wife of Abram's the name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, and the father of Milcah, and the father of Ishak. But Sarai was barren; she had no child. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Okay, so let me give you guys a little bit of context. I'm going to throw this up here before we start talking about this, because I know that last week when we talked about where everyone was in relation to the world, we mentioned about, because remember, we're looking at now post-flood post-flood geography, presumably. And so the biblical writers are hoping people know that, these people are from here. You remember when we talked about the table of nations? They were saying that these were individuals that are now by the sea, and you had the ark that settled in the mountains of Ararat. So I want to share with you guys this map that might help you guys out to see kind of what's going on here. So we have on the right, on the top, you have Mount Ararat, kind of over here. See my finger over here, up here. Noah's Ark. That's presumably, as we know, it wasn't on Mount Ararat. The Bible actually says settled on the mountains of Ararat. So presumably, it could be anywhere in that whole general vicinity where there are mountains. But if you look kind of down where there's a Tigris and the Euphrates, there are two major rivers in the area. Presumably, Babylon was founded near where the remnants of the Tower of Babel presumably were found. Babylon, the ancient city of Babylon, was founded around 2300 BC. And then you have the Ur of the Chaldea down at the bottom. You see there kind of, let me see where my hand is. Here in this general area, you have the Ur of the Chaldea. There is this Tower of Babel where this person believes the Tower of Babel was in that whole area. And so around 2275 BC, give or take, we're not going to be, hard on those dates. But you see that from this area, or the Chaldeans, you see that Terah, Abram's father, travels all the way up what's called the Fertile Crescent into that area, all the way up to Haran. And he goes up to Haran, which is near the top of the Euphrates. And in that place, he kind of settles there. And so he has not only himself, he has his extended family. He has Lot. He has Sarai. He has his kids in there. So this is the second section, guys, where we meet Terah, and we meet Abram, and we meet his wife Sarai, and his brothers and his family. What do you guys see in terms of this situation? Any thoughts that come up from this introduction to Abram's family story, his dynamic, if you will?
Well, for me, the first thing that jumps out is how we'll see later on how God has to intervene to bring about Israel, because Sarai was barren, and kind of Moses kind of he underscores that. And so if God doesn't intervene, there is no Israel. So that's the first thing that jumps out for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I guess just looking at it, what jumps out at me, and we were talking about this earlier, Nelson, was the role of Abram's father and in the journey that Abram would take. Now, I'm not going to go into all of it, but I feel, and the Bible does not say this. This is me speculating based on what I'm reading here in the text. Your son dies. It's like, why would you want to stay there? Everything reminds you of him. You know what I'm saying? And so it seems like sometime after the death of Haran, Haran, right? That was his name?
Yeah, Haran begot Lot, and Haran died before his father. Yeah. So you have the death of a child, yeah.
Yeah. So he kind of picks up her family. He's like, all right, we're going to Canaan. But what strikes me is like, all right, you're going to Canaan, but man, you're going like the wrong way, bro. Because as your finger was pointing, right, you're trying to go like this. Ur of the Chaldeans was down here. And they had to travel to Canaan, which was across. Instead, who knows? Maybe there was desert. I don't know. Instead, they follow all the Euphrates River and all that stuff all the way up here to where you find the place where they settled, which was Haran, right?
Haran, yeah, up here. If you want to see it,
right, thanks.
That whole area,
which was Haran, and so it's like, bro, it looks like you're going the wrong way, And when I think about that, it's like, I don't know what the reason was for that, but if let's say he could have done the trip directly across, and I'm like, man, I do that many times in my life where I say like, oh, it's good for me to do this, or it's good for me to go there, and I take the long route just to see like, hey man, if something else pops up and I don't have to do the thing which I know I have to do, even better for me, and throughout the text, at least in Genesis, you see that God is just trying to get his people, or people in general, just to move, like go to places, see other people, and we get stuck. And so it's the same story here with Abram's dad. He's like, all right, we're going to Canaan. Oh, you know what? Let's make a pit stop here, and let's just settle here. But he had the right idea, because that's the place where God was going to later call Abram. And so in a way, as in the family structure, the father kind of has like that that responsibility to kind of say, hey, this is where we're going as a family, and then whatever the father does is the example that the son will receive, and later on in the story, we'll see that Abram just kind of travels everywhere. But why does he never stay in the place where God says, this is your place, you know? And we'll see that. But anyway, just to kind of point out that the traveling thing doesn't make sense at all. And it seems like many times in our lives, we take the long route simply to try to find a way out of the way that we know we should be going.
Yeah, that's another example of how, you know, in some way mirrors what we go through in our story of faith. You know, part of me wonders that he could have tried to follow just the water. Yeah, I would have stuck close to the water instead of going through that hot desert. I don't know what the conditions were 2,200 years ago, or way more than that. So I don't know, can't speak to that part, but you're right. Sometimes we do tend to take like a detour in life. One thing that I noticed in this one is that they are still kind of marrying within themselves, within their tribe, their family, and they're not really going too far out in terms of like second, third cousins. They're keeping it kind of first cousins. And so
marries his niece, bro.
Yeah, that to the modern reader, to us, it's kind of weird, very weird. And I think,
half sister, as we'll find out.
Yeah, so you see that part. Now, granted, when we were talking about when we looked at we talked about this after the story of the fall, and we looked at Cain and Abel. So from a genetic structure, from a genetic standpoint, if you have two individuals that have perfect DNA, there's no flaws, no imperfections in the DNA strand, then presumably they could mate and have an offspring that is not flawed at all. But it seems like the further along that goes, the more of a risk for defects to develop and then perpetuate within that line. And so you do notice that this is still happening, the marriages within the family structure. And it's only until you get to a few hundred years later on, where you see Moses and the children of Israel later on, that at that point, they're like, okay, yeah, no, you don't marry within certain degrees of a family member. But by this point, it was kind of still, I guess, it seems like the line, the genetic line was okay. And to go back again to the discussion we had last week, this isn't an issue of race, like race is not mixing. This was an issue of like simple, like just genes. Over time, if you look nowadays, there's some people groups, like I think, for example, like the Ashkenazi Jews, for example, who still like intermarry themselves, but they have higher rates of birth defects because of that practice of marrying within someone's close family unit. But back in those days, the genetics didn't seem to have been as bad as they are now, which makes sense. Over thousands of years, it gets worse. Just like we saw in the story of the lineages of Lot's parents, whatever, or of Abram's ancestors, the further back you get, the longer they lived, because sin wasn't as effective or had affected the earth as much. Now we're living years afterwards, so we're not living long as they were back then, with hundreds of years. But it's and also we're not marrying, which for the modern reader, I'm like, yeah, that's great. It's great that we're not doing that.
Could it have been a power move? And I guess I'm asking because you have the Tower of Babel, where we studied that they were all together, all same language, same culture, all that stuff, and nothing was impossible for them. And so you have them living in this like metropolitan area, which was probably for them was like the New York City or the Tokyo of their time, and they're still marrying within themselves. There's plenty of people around, in the city that you could possibly marry your family into. But we see that the bigger your family cluster is, maybe the more influence and the more strength you have together, the more you can accomplish than if you were to grow someone else's family. And that's just me throwing a couple cents in there, not really.
Yeah.
There's no foundation for that apart from like just speculating on what the verse is saying and what we studied last week.
Possible. I mean, we have here, we have the story of Shem, And you're looking at post-flood to the story of Abram. So somewhere within that line, the Tower of Babel happens. Don't recall off the top of my head how far generationally it happened, but you have the list of how long they lived. So somewhere in there, it did kind of happen. And so who knows? There's only a list. So it's interesting that in verse 10, we know that Shem was one of three sons born to Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? And then after the flood, we mentioned Arphaxad, but it says that Shem also had many sons and daughters. So we don't know how many he had. So yeah, there was tons of them. But by the time we get now to the end of that story, where we have Terah and his sons, once again, he's got 3 kids. And so it's kind of like a interesting little bookend where you have Noah having the 3 kids, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then Terah having Haran, Abram, and who's his third brother? I keep forgetting. There's Nahor. Whenever there's 3 kids, there's always one that's kind of like left out. Who's the other one? No offense to parents with 3 or more kids, but there's that kind of interesting parallel that happens. So very much could have been like a power move, because then kind of who's within your ranks, instead of like, all right, who's this other person, coming into our midst.
Yeah. And you see that later on in the story. Isaac sends Jacob to go, back to the family.
Which, yes, by the way, as you're kind of seeing this, if you're just reading this for the first time, you're going to notice that next week, Genesis follows a pattern where it kind of introduces you to a story, and then it will go back and it will give you a little bit more of a detail into like the same story that's giving you the overview for it. Happened with the creation account, it happened with Adam and Eve, it happened with the flood, and now it's going to happen here, where you're going to see a situation that Abram has with his father that kind of prompts him leaving Ur of the Chaldeans to begin with. So here, this is just like, oh yeah, he decided to leave because, like we said, he maybe had a death in the family, but there was more to it than that. Like, there's a reason why that exit happened.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to notice, though, that as you're seeing, that Abram is kind of growing up with already an experience where someone loses a child. So it's kind of like a foreshadowing thing. I don't know if in some ways where someone, in this case, a child dies before the father, and he presumably knows what it's like, the pain that causes a family, and that's something that marked him. Will it show up later on? Maybe. We'll have to see. Foreshadowing. Yeah. So what else we got? Any other thoughts on this one? Kind of straightforward. And by the way, guys, if you out there have any questions for us, as always, shoot us a text, because this is meant to be not just between the 3 of us, and we enjoy that you guys are watching us. But if you have any questions out there, just leave them in the chats. We're probably gonna have time to get to several of them today, so leave them in the chats and we'll try to get to them afterwards. Okay. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna just jump down here. If you have any questions, again, just keep typing them out. I'm going to start reading the last section of our discussion today, where God has given Moses has given this big kind of lineage of who Abram was and where he came from. But now we zoom into the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. And in Genesis chapter 12, we have the introduction of when God introduces himself to Abram. And something that's interesting seeing here, looking chapter 12, verse 1, is that when it says the Lord, this is not Elohim, God. This is the word that it's using is a tetragrammaton, which is what we know as Yahweh. This is the covenant personal name for God. So it says, now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so this is where God now has an encounter, a one-on-one conversation with Abram. And so this is one of these moments that, God does speak to other people, and he has these big general declarative moments where he speaks to humanity or a family. But here God's taking an interest in Abram specifically, and he tells him this. Yeah, we're going to get to that here in a second as we discuss it. So it says in verse 4, and this is where we're going to stop today, because after this, we're going to get to the beginning of the story of Abram, and we're going to start digging into that next week. But for now, we're trying to look at the big picture of what was the story or the background to Abram's life, and kind of what were the influences that that kind of marked him. Because Abraham's story, just like our story, it comes from a context, that our context informs the way that we live our lives. And if you've never thought about this, it's very important to do so. But here, this is what we're doing today. We're understanding the context that Abram came from. So it says in verse 4, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and went from him. And Abram was 75 years. Oh, excuse me. Let me go back here. And Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot, his nephew here, went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And so again, let me just toss this up on the screen here if you guys are following us. There's that on the top from Babel. You have him presumably now not following the waterways anymore. Now he's kind of branching off on his own. And so this is where it's interesting, guys, that now he's kind of going off on his own. Like we talked about last time, his dad presumably could have just cut through the desert. It would have been harder, but it would have gotten to his destination faster. He chose maybe the easy way, or was the waterway. But now Abram is having said, okay, you're not going to make a map. I'm not going to show you where you're going to go to right now, but depart and you're going to go to a land that I'm going to show you. And Abraham kind of does it. And he's 75 years old. And he goes out, and there's somebody that goes with him. What do we got? Thoughts?
Well, two thoughts. The first thought is the Torah doesn't tell us why God chose Abraham. It tells us that Noah was a righteous man, but it doesn't tell us that there's no qualities why God chose him. The second thing is God told him to leave your family, and then Lot was with him. What happened there? ¿Qué pasó? He disobeyed?
Wait, repeat that. That he told him what?
God told him right there. It says in verse, I want you to get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house. And he allows Lot to come along with him. So those are the two things that jumped out. Why did God choose Abraham? The Torah is silent. It could be that maybe as he was worshiping his father's gods, that maybe he found Elohim, and he started worshiping Elohim. And God said, okay, as you're searching out for me, I'm going to draw near to you. And why did he allow Lot to come along?
By the way, you're mentioning something that you're going to see later on with his father, because we don't have any mention right now of the religious practice of his family. So you're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but you're already starting to see, because the whole situation where he breaks his father's idols and all that stuff, that happens a little bit later. And so you start seeing kind of why that point you're making speaks to that. But for the reader, if you're kind of just looking at this, he's making a point that you're going to connect the dots with next time. But you're right. Like that whole thing with Lot, that's an interesting detail where he makes, God makes that promise with him. I'm going to bless you, make you a great nation. And then all of a sudden, I want to come too. You know what I'm saying? He just shows up.
Oh, yeah, you should stay. But he allows him to come.
You guys have to give a warning, man. Those are big things that happen in the story that we're not there yet.
Yeah, spoiler alert.
Yeah, man.
It's all right.
No, but yeah, honestly, I don't really see a problem with it. I don't know much about the Jewish tradition as it attests to this particular circumstance, but I am that if your eldest brother died without having an offspring, and you were the second in line, it was your duty for that first offspring that you have with your wife, for him to carry on that name for your brother, even though he died without having an offspring. And so to me, the way that I see Lot is like, all right, he lost his father. And so who's going to take me under their wing now? And I think in some way or another, Moses didn't have a child yet. And I could see him taking his nephew under his wing and being that father figure. Not just because he might have loved Lot, but also because, maybe that was a responsibility that was given to him, seeing that his brother was now deceased.
Yeah.
So that's how I would explain that, I guess. I don't see anything wrong with it per se, but I like the fact that it labels how old each person is, because you can kind of do the math very quickly, and you can see that Abram doesn't leave his house once his father dies. It's not like, oh, okay, God, I'm gonna leave my house once my dad is dead, or I'll pick up the stuff and do what you tell me to. But he leaves well before his father dies, like some 30 plus years before his dad dies. And so his attachment to God and what God had called him to do seems to have been more important than to live off the last few years with his dad. And to be like maybe that caregiver to his father, or maybe even care enough to say, hey, if I stay here, maybe I'll amass more of a wealth, or I'll amass more of my dad's inheritance, seeing that I was constantly here taking care of him. Instead, he kind of just gets what he has at the moment and leaves, leaving perhaps most of the inheritance of his dad to the youngest brother.
Possibly.
Yeah, and so he cares more about that, and it says who Abraham is as a person early on. That yeah, he's gonna have his struggles, but mostly he cares about this relationship that he has with God. He initially definitely believes God's promise here.
Yeah. You was going to mention that, you have Terah begetting Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So I wonder if Abram, being the oldest, presumably, I'm assuming he was the oldest here. You have Haran maybe being the youngest, but yes, definitely Haran was the one who had kids first, because he begets Lot. And it makes that mention that Terah takes his son Abram in verse 31. His son Abram takes his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, who at this point was deceased, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Nahor, his son Abram's wife, and that was his niece, I guess. There's a little family gymnastics you're gonna have to keep track of initially here, and so they leave together. So it could have been that Lot was very close to his uncle Abram. You mentioned Moses having the son, but I think you meant probably Abram was Lot's uncle.
Yeah, that's
right.
What I meant to say.
Yeah, that's all right. Moses did write this, and I was trying to think, did Moses have a nephew, Aaron? Yeah, he did. No, he did. Actually, he did.
For this.
Yeah, it was it. Moses did have nephews, but they got fried. But that's a story from that was much later. Yeah. Wow. I just noticed another parallel, because that would have happened to Lot too.
All these spoilers, guys.
Spoilers.
Oh man, spoilers. Man, this was like an Exodus. You got to read to the next book, and we're not going to get to that this week. But anyways, so yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to just for me, when it comes to having that, the parallel that we experience in life, I think, is that at some point we all have to have an encounter with God in a personal way. So there's that, now the Lord said to Abram, whatever story, whatever background might have happened in Abram's life or his father's life or before that, at some point I think he comes to the decision where he comes face to face with a choice, which is, am I going to leave my comfort zone, my security, and now branch out into this different land, and it seems like the promise that God was giving him was like, hey, I'm gonna make you into a great nation, I will bless you, and I'll make your name great. And so it's like, I think he understands that to have a great nation and to be a great nation, you have to have either kids or an army or something.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. But he's old, because it already mentions that his wife can't have any kids. Right. And the only one that comes with him at the chamaquito, you have Lot, who's not his son. It's a son figure, but I'm gonna build a nation with a wife that can't have kids, and my nephew, who's I love him. He's like a son, but he's not really like my legal successor to my inheritance. And now this deity is telling me that I'm gonna be the father of a nation, and I'm about about 190 years old or whatever, and I'm gonna make me a nation.
And Nelson, a nation that's going to bless all the families of the earth.
Yeah, so it's not just like a good, like I'm gonna be one of the family. I'm gonna be a family that blesses everybody else with worldwide implications. But I have nothing that I can attest to say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, he has some raw materials to work with. So I can see this. This is him starting from not only a flat line, he's starting from a negative. So this is where I think, where he's the father of the faith, is that he takes God at his word. And in his own imperfect way, he decides to follow God as imperfectly as he can, because we're going to see through the rest of the story, spoiler alert, Abram is a very flawed individual. He has a lot of faith, but he's very flawed in the way that he lives his life. And whoever is without sin, you can throw the first stone at this man, because again, we're very much like this dude.
Yeah.
But the first time we meet him, we find a man who comes from a home that's seen a lot of pain, that he himself doesn't have the raw materials that God somehow sees, but yet he's still willing to trust God at his word despite his circumstance. And this is where I think that God sees, okay, I can work with this guy. He may not have everything, he may be flawed, as we're gonna see, but he's someone that has a heart for wanting to draw nearer, as Lafitte was talking about, as we're gonna see why God might have called him. But the raw materials that he had wasn't circumstantial. I think this is an important part to consider, is that when we're looking at how God does work, God doesn't need raw materials. We already saw this in the creation story, where God creates out of nothing. God doesn't need raw materials. He just needs a willing heart. And once he has that willing heart, sky's the limit in this case.
I think it's powerful to note that whereas at first God makes the land and makes it suitable for man and then places man in it, here he is making Abram leave his homeland to go to a land that he's going to show him. And so he's calling him out instead of calling him in, which is kind of interesting. But I think that something we need to look at is definitely this blessing that you're talking about here, Nelson, because it says here, and I will bless you, I'll make your name great, all that stuff. And definitely, this is a huge counterpoint to, Babel, where they were making their own name great. God's saying, I'm going to make your name great. And at the same time, it's kind of speaking of this blessing. And this is the first time we kind of really see blessing being bestowed on like a single individual apart from creation with the garden. And so we have to define it based on what we've seen so far. We can't define it based on everything else. In the first 12 chapters, right, and a few verses, what does it mean to look like you're a person that's blessed by God? And from the creation story, we can see that to be blessed is to have a genuine relationship with God first, and then also to have a companion. Blessed because you have this relationship with God. You're blessed because you have companionship, and you're blessed because you live off of what God has made for you through the land, through your work, through your planting. And so in a way, I feel like this false sense that Christianity has somehow made about, when you're blessed, then you're rich, you have no problems. This, that, others,
money status.
It seems like here to be blessed is simply to have a genuine relationship with God, to have companionship, and to live off the land that God has made for you. That's it. Now, whether it's going to be a bunch of labor, whether you're going to face sorrows and tribulations and all these difficulties, whether you're going to lose loved ones, whether you're going to get kicked out at your house, all those things, they might happen. And guess what? To God, He's still blessing. And so that's such a difficult thing for us to contend with, because for so long it's been preached from the pulpit. It's been said in different ways that to be blessed is to be debt free. It's to own the things that you need to, and to have that family, and to have the things which society views as being successful. And that's not what God is saying here. God's not saying, hey, you're going to have all this great stuff. In fact, he's actually giving him a huge task, because it's not that God is saying like, okay, you're going to be blessed, but the rest of the nations, they're not going to be blessed until you bless them. No, he wants the best for everyone. It just so happens that, listen, Abram, I've been thinking, and you're going to be the vessel by which I bless everyone else. And it's not that you become a Christian, all of a sudden you're blessed, and you're more blessed than the guy who lives across the street who's voting for a candidate you're not in favor of. No, that's not how that works. God is wanting to bless, or he has blessed everyone. It just so happens that, he chooses you to kind of be that vessel here.
In some ways, I think you're saying that God's blessings may not look the way you think they do.
Yeah. And he's choosing a 75-year-old man. Think about this. He didn't choose a young man. He chose a man who was probably enjoying retirement. I don't have kids. I'm here. I don't have to worry about anything. And remember who wrote the book was Moses, who God called when he was 80 years old.
Yeah, I mean, but based on that though, I like what one of our viewers mentioned. My man Alentime, he mentioned something very good. Said the name Abraham means father, so it must have been difficult for everyone to explain that he had no children at the time. So interesting that if Father Abraham's where you get that name from, but if his name meant father, the man had no kids, that might have been awkward. But I think once again, this is where it goes to the fact that when it comes to success with God, God's the one that creates it. What sometimes tends to happen is that we can attribute the success to our own hands, to the works of our own hands. Yeah. Many times we do it, or we say, God has blessed us. Look at how hard I've worked. I built this with God's grace, with God's help. But that really isn't fully God, because you had a hand in that. Something as fully God's blessings. One, it's going to be something that he does unilaterally. One, that's God's side. Two, it may not look the way you think it does. Like Brian was just going on about, like, it's not just being, having money and having status and having wealth. The blessings that God wanted to give Abraham and through the rest of the world are different than what people might expect. And so it's just like this paradigm that I think we sometimes still wrestle to let go of today, even within churches, of this idea that healthy, wealthy, and powerful is equivalent to God's blessing, or is indicative of God's blessing on our lives or our church or our nation or whatever. And that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. And to kind of add to that, my NIV says, that these people will be blessed through you. But I do believe that a better translation is in you, because he's speaking about this promise, right? This Jesus figure, this Messiah figure that would come later on. And something that Genesis chapter 12 really points out is how the same promise that God made to Eve in chapter 3 or something.
3.
Right. Even after, Cain killed Abel, even after everyone, was horrible and evil, even after the flood and massive genocide, even after they had to resettle the earth, even after, they took a wrong turn, God's promise is still there. Like he hasn't changed. Like his promise is still going to come about, and he's made it. He's arranged it so that a descendant from Eve would have, lived through all this and be able to bring about that promise that he did, that he promised a bunch of chapters ago, and probably hundreds of, maybe even thousands of years ago. And so it's just like, hey, when God promises something, bro, it's going to happen. And when you think like, oh, there's a very slim chance, it's still a chance, and God's going to make,
I think you answer one of the questions here where Martha asked, does the Bible focus on descendants to show Jesus' family lineage?
Yeah.
See the connection there? I think in some places, in some ways, yeah. I mean, keep in mind that this is from a patriarchal society too. So there's that part where there was a lot more mention about the men, because that was how, you know, I don't think, I think in the past you guys remember hearing this word. This word might be a bad word nowadays, but the word bastard is like, oh, you bastard. That literally means having no father.
Yeah.
Right. It's in the real sense, because to be considered to have no father to claim you meant that you were illegitimate. So it meant that you didn't have access to, you know, to being basically a legal child of your father and having access to the inheritance thereof. And this was a patriarchal society where it took that and obviously ran with it in a very strong sense. Not so much in our society today. We don't have that so much. But this kind of actually goes back to kind of a point that we were making earlier, where God calls Abram to leave his father's home and in a way kind of go and break that kind of patriarchal idea of saying, hey, I rely on my name for security and success, where God's breaking that mold and saying, okay, listen, I'm gonna make you a great nation, but not because your daddy was great, and not because your grandfather was great, not because you live with your parents. I'm gonna make you a great nation because I'm going to bless you, not because of the works of your hand. And so this is a way that this happens. But if you look at the book of Matthew, if I'm not mistaken, it does follow the genealogy. And there's another one in the New Testament. I can't remember which one, but one follows it from Abram, and the other one follows it from Adam, actually, to show that Jesus also came from this long lineage of men and women who were faithful to God in their previous lives, or previous experience in their past, whatever. Answering questions here, guys. So if you have any questions, just feel free to leave them in the comments here. So a question for you guys here. I'm going to throw this up on the screen. Jordan, do the Jews believe that they are the chosen people because of Abram?
Yeah, I would say so.
Absolutely. But here's the funny part, as you're going to see. So does Islam. Islam has a point for this one too. In monotheistic religion, there's three of them: Christianity, Judaism, Islam. The issue comes because of who do they believe the blessing was descended down to, if it was through Isaac or if it was through Ishmael. And that happens later on. But one thing to consider is that the word Jew, it comes from the line of Judah, which happens later on, much later on. And so this is where I think it's important to remember. And I think not only is it, it's sad to think that sometimes this happened to the Semitic people. I'm just going to say Jews because this happened to the Semitic people in general. And Semitic people are Shemites. These are the descendants of Shem, all of them. But it also happens to Christianity itself, because the word of blessing that God gave to Abram was saying, I'm going to bless the world through the Jews. Didn't say that. It said through his lineage, through his line, Abram's line, I'm going to bless the world. And to be fair, the whole world has been blessed because of, in some ways, knowledge of God and the experience of Abraham. And each of the monotheistic religions has deep problems. Christianity has its fair share of issues. Judaism has its fair share of issues. Islam has its fair share of issues. All of them trace their lineage, if you will, to a man named Abram. So this is where we all kind of share a common ancestry, if you will. But it's important to remember that it's not because of the lineage that we come from that God will bless us. It's because we are following God individually. You know how the saying goes that God has no grandchildren, is that we all must come to a decision where we are going to follow God personally in a way that it might be different than my father's or my grandfather's, different than the way my comfort level is. I have to follow God personally because that's how God will God wants that personal connection with me, to leave my comfort zone and to have that one-on-one relationship with me. But yeah.
And to your point, Nelson, I mean, if we see that Jesus is a descendant from Abram, then I mean this promise is done, because through Jesus, it wasn't like about you being all like about Judaism or Islam or paganism. It was simply about like, hey, whatever religion, whatever demographic, whatever society you belong to, if you accept Jesus, that's it. Then that's it. That was the whole point. And so, in a way, what he's promising is like, yeah, all nations will be blessed. Yeah, all nations will be blessed. And that's what Jesus was for. That's why Jesus came down here, and what he kind of accomplished for us is that, all three of us come from totally different backgrounds, and yet when we come to accept Jesus, we somehow become this like one movement, this one nation, that is way bigger than Abram could have ever foretold.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. Good chatting here. That's going on social media. I'll show here that Maria, for example, said having a relationship with God and living off the land was the plan for Adam and Eve. They weren't going to be rich, but they were going to have all they needed. In that sense, Abram is returning to the Eden model in a way. Yeah, I can definitely see that, and I think it's important for us to remember that we don't need, kind of what we talked about earlier, that we don't have to have the biggest house to have God's favor, or to know that we have God's favors. Abram, as you're going to see, he wasn't broke either. He wasn't like he had like just like a house and that's it, or a little house. He had servants and he had a big land. He gets into disputes. He's a very important, powerful, financially secure man in his own right. But it's important to remember and see this, that you can have all that wealth, but if you don't have that connection with God, it's kind of what Jesus said. What benefit does it do one to acquire the whole world and still lose your soul? But it doesn't mean that if you don't have the money, that therefore you don't have the blessing, because he had all that money and that power, but he still didn't have what that society considered important, which was an heir.
Yeah. I mean, what does it matter if you have all that? You have no one to pass it on.
Right? Exactly. So I don't know, something for us to consider.
And that's why it's so important. And I think Lafitte mentioned this. Like, the dude was 75 when he left home with this promise, and yeah, man, he was gonna get much older before it came to fruition. And you see how God, I think very intentionally, picks this one guy who can't have the one thing that he really needs, and God's saying, I'm going to provide that thing that you need, that thing that your hands can't make, I'm going to make for you.
That's a good one. I like that. And I think that's something for us to consider. That's really what we're trying to get to in terms of what God might be telling us. What's that thing that I can't get with my own hands? And that might be where, who knows, where God wants to work and show himself that he is God in our lives. Anyways, next one, I see you, Island Time, about the idol worshipers. We alluded to the idols a little bit this time. We're going to get to that next week here. So a little bit more. So that way we have a little bit of context that we can take people through, because we're already jumping ahead a little bit. So we're doing really good on time, and we're gonna close up now. We're not gonna go 15 minutes beyond like we did last time. So let's finish with some closing thoughts. As we looked at all these few sections of the genealogy and the backdrop to Abram's story, and now the end where God calls Abram specifically, what closing thoughts are you guys kind of left with that you want us to kind of focus on? I'll start with Brian this time today.
Closing thoughts. I think I mentioned it. My closing thought, especially when it comes to these first few verses of chapter 12, is one, the fact that when God promises to do something, it's going to happen. A billion things, well, not a billion things, I'm exaggerating, but many things happen from chapter 3 to chapter 12, and none of those things made a dent in God's promise to Abram and to Eve. And so in a way, I feel like when I read scripture and I see God's promise for my life, what his purpose for my life is, there isn't a reason for me to doubt that it will happen, because horrible and wonderful things happened from when he promised Eve, and here's Abram, and then many years will pass, and Jesus will come. And so one way or another, God's going to work it out to accomplish his promises in my life. And I really hold on to that. And I hold on to the fact that, hey, chapter 12 is a challenge for us to view blessing for what God intended it to be, not for what I hope it is.
Strong. Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. Lafitte, thoughts?
Well, I'm comforted that the Bible doesn't tell us why God chose Abraham. Just like the Bible doesn't tell us why Jesus chose the disciples. And so I am comforted that God chose me. And all I have to do is just accept the invitation and just follow him. We will see. Abraham was not perfect. We're gonna see he's gonna make choices and he's gonna make mistakes, just like me. But God chose Abraham just as God chose me, us. And so that's my comfort tonight. That's my thought, closing thought. Just obey. Just walk with him. Even though you don't know where he's taking you, just trust and obey.
That's the name of a song there, man. What do you say? Is that are you giving the snaps, or are you saying money?
No. That's like when someone has like a spoken word or a poem, you're not supposed to clap or something.
You got to snap though, man, because this looks like you're trying to you're doing the money.
I didn't want to take over the mic, and just like do one of those things. So
it's all good, man. I really like where God shows up to Abram, because he, we know Abraham as Abraham, but God makes the promise with Abram before. So the reason why you're going to see God changes Abraham's name to or God changes Abram's name to Abraham, and we know Abraham as Abraham because God called him Abraham. But God comes to, and this is kind of alluding to what Lafitte said, God calls Abram before he does any of that. And I think once we see his life lived out, Abram does become a great person. He does do many things. And one thing that I look at, especially in the book of Hebrews, when you look at the book of Hebrews, and this is the New Testament, and you look back, compare the story that the book of Hebrews gives us to Abraham's story, and compare that to what we're going to read in the next few chapters ahead for the rest of the season, you're going to see that there's a bit of a difference. But it just gives me goosebumps, and it just makes me so grateful knowing that the gospel story is lived out in Abram's experience, because Abram is someone who comes from a dysfunctional, a very broken place, and he doesn't get it perfect every single step of the way. He's not like God calls him and he's like, yeah, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna follow, and then it's a straight line all the way to become Abraham, and he goes to sacrifice Isaac. This dude fails once and time again, to a point where God needs to change his name, to a point where God needs to tell him to stop trying to have kids. He tells him to God has to make a sacrifice and have a covenant where God, we'll see that. So anyways, God has to step in 1, 2, 3, 4. I can count at least 6 times before this thing finishes, where God has to personally say, okay, listen, you're not following me, brother. You need to follow me, and you're not doing it. So you got to do this, because I need the whole nations of the earth to be blessed, but you're not following along. But still, Abram kind of drags, and he somehow gets to the end. And it's because of his heart, because of his desire to follow God, that we see this. And we don't have this is the craziest thing. We don't have a full conclusion to Abraham. You're going to see that it's kind of like his left hanging in the air in that tense relationship between him and God. But I'm just warmed up, because that's a relationship that I think we all have. It's not like one shot where we're all perfect and we never fail God. But when we compare our story to the light of eternity, as it says in the book of Hebrews, Abraham's story was that he never failed. But it's only perfect because of Jesus's life in Abraham. And you're going to see what we mean by that. But seeing how Abram's story plays out, especially in light of how Jesus lived his life through Abraham, and we're going to unpack that concept later on, it's so encouraging, because it knows that it gives me the certainty and the comfort that I don't have to get it right. I need to follow God. And like Lafitte said, trust and obey, but don't get it twisted. It's not like God is grading me on perfection, because Abraham failed a lot and he still made it. He's still in the Hall of Heroes. So the same thing can be said for us.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So y'all, I want to thank you again for being here. Lafitte and Brian, as always, thank you guys. I'll let you guys go. Brian, take it easy. Peace. Lafitte, take it easy. And thank you for being a part of our show today. We had a fun time. Were you blessed? Did you enjoy this? If you enjoyed this today's show, please send our just like the video and share it. That's how Facebook and YouTube's algorithms get this to more eyes. So if a lot of people like this, then they'll be like, oh, this is a video worth sharing and putting on people's algorithm. That's how you can do your small part in liking and helping us to share this video with others by liking it and sharing it. So that would help us out. If you have any questions, once again, feel free to leave them on our Facebook page or on YouTube page. We're going to try to get to all the questions that you've given us probably next week or the weeks afterwards. Just follow us again on Facebook and on Twitter. If you haven't done so yet, go to our website, miamitemple.org, and subscribe to our newsletter, our weekly e-newsletter. This week, Pastor Brian is going to be speaking, and his sermon is going to be hot fire. It's not titled that, but it's going to be great. You're going to love it. So check it out. And listen, wherever you are, I know you might be watching live, or maybe you're watching in the future. Is it in a replay? I don't know what may be going on in your life, but I just want to pray with you today as we finish, so that God can just live his life through you, just like he did with Abraham. So let me just bow my heads and we'll pray together. Father, I want to thank you so much that we were able to study this today together with our friends today in the internet. Bless each one of them, and whatever may be going on in their lives and whatever issues they may be facing right now, we just ask that you would help them to get to know you in a real way, just like Abram did, knowing that as we put our faith in you, you can make great things out of us despite our circumstances and despite the challenges that we may face. So give us a wonderful time and give us a wonderful rest of the week ahead. This is our prayer in your name. Amen. So once again, guys, I want to thank you for joining us today. And again, if you haven't done so, like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys all next week. Bye-bye.